Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Chris Mars here from Second Azos. Today, I'm coming with you with the second lecture in our nutritional series, building upon what we talked about previous lecture on energy systems. Now we're going to talk about fuel sources on how we create energy. So with this short little lecture, we're going to discuss the following. We're going to talk about the different types of fuel sources that we can take into our bodies, and how these apply to the different anaerobic energy pathways. This will be a little bit of a review from the last lecture. And finally, how is carbohydrates used as a fuel source for one of the anaerobic pathways called glycolysis? So let's talk about a little bit of review. In lecture number 1, we discussed and defined bioenergetics. We discussed the 3 different energy production pathways to create adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. And again, we defined ATP as the basic energy unit utilized by the human body for all its biological processes. And finally, we discussed this concept of intensity versus duration and how it determines the energy pathways. Now, let's go back to our schematic here. And so when we talked about intensity versus duration, we talked about at maximum intensity, you can only hold that duration for such a short period. And so if you're talking about anywhere around 100% and anywhere from 90 to 100% of maximum effort, you can only hold that for about anywhere from 2 to 10 seconds, depending on how trained you are. Essentially, this is very close to high intensity training in the gym. When we start talking about dropping that intensity a little bit and say getting closer to a 100, 150, 200 meter sprint, you can hold that for a little bit longer, for closely, let's say upwards to 30 minutes. Now, and of course, the longer you go, the lower the intensity is. And we talked about this concept is anything below 2 minutes, we would consider that anaerobic in its capacity. And this is very stovepipe, very simplistic terms when we're talking about the energy pathways. But also, if it's greater than 2 minutes in duration, we consider that aerobic. Because when we look at this 2-minute mark, if we're doing blood work looking at glycolysis versus aerobic respiration for ATP production, you would find is at this 2-minute mark, 51% of your ATP production is aerobic, where 49% would be anaerobic. So in rough terms, that 2-minute mark is that delineation point between anaerobic versus aerobic work. Now, I want you to keep this in mind as we talk about through this lecture and the upcoming lectures as well. So let's talk about our first fuel source, and that's carbohydrates. A lot of times you'll see me denote carbohydrates with the abbreviation CHO. And so carbohydrates include a couple of different types, monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. A monosaccharide is just a single glucose molecule, all right? And a glucose molecule, we tend to see this as blood sugar because this is the usable form of carbohydrates in the human body. The glucose is what's converted into ATP via the glycolytic pathway and aerobic respiration, also known as oxidative phosphorylation. Its stored form is glycogen, and you'll find glycogen in the liver and in the muscle. Skeletal muscle keeps, about 3 to 5% of its glucose stored in glycogen form, whereas most of the body's glycogen storages are found in the liver. And typically, the human body has enough stored glycogen for upwards to 2.5 to 3 hours of continuous aerobic work. That's just for a standard trained individual. There's a little bit that changes with it with age and gender, but that's kind of the norm. Next step is let's define monosaccharides, glucose, and all that a little bit more. So a monosaccharide is a single carbohydrate molecule. And what I'm showing you here is the C6H12O6. This is the basic chemical form of a monosaccharide, also known as glucose. So if you see glucose, its chemical form is C6H12O6. Now, when we talk about a disaccharide, that's just 2 of these monosaccharide molecules put together. And then a polysaccharide is 3 or more of these monosaccharides together in a chain form. So when you start hearing about complex carbohydrates, starches, and stuff like that, we're talking about polysaccharides. And you'll find a lot of your polysaccharides in your spaghettis and your starches, wheat products, and stuff like that. Now let's move on to our next fuel source, and that is fats. And we'll cover how fats are utilized more when we talk about aerobic respiration in a couple more lectures. But we find these as in fatty acids, and these are when triglycerides are broken down into their basic unit. And fatty acids are what are converted into ATP through the oxidative phosphorylation pathway. And that's why fats are known as the primary fuel source when it comes to endurance sports and stuff like that. Triglycerides are a stored form of fats, and basically a triglyceride is just a single glyceride molecule with 3 fatty acid chains on it, and that's what you see right here. Other uses for fats are phospholipids. These make the membranes of cells and stuff like that, and also steroids. So fats are created in steroids. Steroids are used to kind of help with the bonding in cell membranes, and also the synthesis of sex hormones. But when we talk about fats as a fuel source, we're talking about this fatty acid chain, and we'll discuss that more in probably, I don't know, be lecture 3, 4, or 5. All right, now let's talk about our other macro nutrient known as protein. Protein is composed of amino acids. So when the body breaks down protein to build other parts of the human body, it breaks it down into amino acids. We've all heard of BCAAs, branched chain amino acids, essential amino acids, stuff like that. These are all subcomponents of protein. Now, protein can be converted into glucose in the liver via gluconeogenesis. All right, and this just means that glucose is created via non-carbohydrate sources. That's what gluconeogenesis means. Also, it can be converted into other stuff. We don't need to worry about all that. But the biggest thing I want you to take out of this is protein is not a primary energy fuel source. If your body is burning protein to create energy, you're not eating properly. Something's wrong. The body is going into a catabolic state. Basically, it's breaking itself down to create energy. And this is a lot of things that we do see when someone's trying to cut weight and not eating enough calories or not the right amount of macronutrients. And so we'll dive into this a lot more as we go along in our lecture series. But bottom line is, out of the 3 macronutrients, and again, macronutrients are our carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Carbohydrates and fats are our energy sources, primary fuel sources for energy, where protein is not a fuel source for energy. All right, I cannot stress that enough. So with these different fuel sources, what does this mean? So let's go back to our 3 energy systems. Right now, we're talking primarily for the anaerobic pathway. We talked about last time that the phosphagen system, also known as the ATP PCR system, does not utilize carbohydrates as a fuel source. It utilizes phosphocreatine, this PC, and it detaches this inorganic phosphate group to ADP, also known as adenosine diphosphate, to create adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And we did talk about a little bit in lecture 1 on how you can utilize phosphocreatine supplements to help create more ATP stores for this pathway. But nowhere in this chemical equation right here do we utilize carbohydrate as a fuel source. Now, so that leaves the next 2 fuel sources, energy pathways of glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. Again, glycolysis is anaerobic, so you're not using oxygen to create ATP. And what we find is carbohydrates are the only fuel source that the body utilizes to create ATP through the glycolytic pathway under anaerobic conditions. So when you're doing your sprints, when you're doing 400s or doing high intensity work in the gym, you're primarily burning carbohydrates. So this is what we talk about when we talk about nutrient timing, the type of foods that you're eating and stuff, because we're targeting a particular energy pathway. And if you're trying to work a particular energy pathway, you have to fuel it correctly. And so remember, carbohydrates are the only fuel source utilized for the glycolytic pathway. And just keep that in mind as we move along in this lecture series on when we start talking about timing and different percentages of macronutrients of carbs and fats that you need to eat based off the type of work you're doing. So in summary, in this lecture, we discussed the 3 different types of energy fuel sources. Again, we have carbohydrates, we got fats, and we got proteins. Remember, protein is not a fuel source to create energy. It is necessary for recovery. The body utilizes protein to rebuild itself. So when we're working out in the gym, you're essentially tearing down the muscle, and the body needs protein to rebuild that muscle. And finally, in future lectures, starting probably in lecture number 4, we'll discuss on how carbohydrates are utilized within the glycolytic pathway and the oxidative phosphorylation pathway to create ATP, our primary energy fuel source. And then we can use that as our jumping block to start talking about nutrient timing and what you should eat and when you should eat too. Thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Take care.